Have you ever wondered how people manage to learn 10, 12, 15 languages and more? Well, if that's the case, you're in for a treat today because I'm interviewing Steve Kaufman, a renowned polyglot who speaks more than 10 languages, and he's 78 years old. So we'll start, Steve, first with maybe you can tell us more about yourself and your language learning background.
Okay, so my name is Steve Kaufman. I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I like languages. During my professional career, I was a diplomat for 7 years. Then I was in the forest industry for quite a long time. Learned some languages along the way. And within the last, I would say, 15, 20 years, say since the age of 60, I've really focused on learning languages. I've learned about 10 in the last 15 years. Right now I'm working on Arabic and Persian. I have a YouTube channel called Lingo Steve. And together with my son, we launched a language learning platform called Link, L-I-N-G-Q. And we can get into all of this details of this in our discussion.
Great. So I personally learn languages using the 80-20 rule, which means like 20% of what you learn is used 80% of the time. So we focus on what's useful. So what's your language learning philosophy? How do you go about language learning in general?
Okay, so I believe very much that we need a lot of input. We need to flood our brain through listening and reading primarily. We need to acquire vocabulary. In other words, comprehension, both oral and reading comprehension are the keys. Once we have a solid vocabulary and a high level of comprehension, it's much easier to develop speaking skills. Traditional instruction puts too much emphasis in my mind on developing those speaking skills early, on trying to instruct people on how to speak correctly, whereas in fact the brain needs to get a lot of experience with the language through massive listening and reading. And so that has always been my approach, whether it be with French back, whatever, how many, 60 years ago, or with Chinese, it's always lots of listening and reading. And then once I start to speak, I don't worry about my mistakes. I don't worry about how I sound. I just communicate.
Okay, so you focus first on a lot of input and speaking comes second. That's not really usual. Most people would say like speak from day one. So that's great advice. Do you recommend watching videos when starting to learn a language then?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. First of all, I don't use much video content because if I have dedicated time, I will read. The advantage of listening is that you can do it anywhere you want, while doing the dishes, cleaning the house, in my car, on a train. So, whereas video, you have to watch the video. And video is less word dense than reading. So, I like video for entertainment, but for language learning, I prefer reading or listening. And I speak when I have the opportunity. So, when I moved to Japan, I had the opportunity right away, so I started speaking right away. Learning Persian in Vancouver, I don't have much opportunity to speak, so I focus just on listening and reading, and maybe speak, after I have maybe 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 words, I start speaking a couple of times a week with a tutor.
You just mentioned how many words you need to have before speaking. Some people say that a native speaker knows between 25 and 30,000 words in their mother tongue, but that they actually use on a daily basis between 3,000 and 5,000 words. Do you think that's enough to get by in a foreign language?
I don't want to disappoint you. I don't agree with that. The 3,000 words, which we measure on our website, that's enough for me to be able to start engaging in a conversation. Fluency is much, much more than that. Far more words than that, and many, many hours of listening and reading. Fluency, which I would equate on the European scale to about a B2, requires a lot more than 3,000 words.
And has your language learning approach changed over the years with technology advancing?
The way I learn is the same. And I would even say that everyone learns the same way. We learn by our brain having the opportunity to listen to meaningful messages, things of interest, in large volume. That's how we all learn. What has changed, of course, is the availability of the internet, MP3 files, online dictionaries. Just this morning I downloaded a podcast in Persian which I then put on an automatic transcription website. So I got a transcript, then I import the transcript into LINQ, and I can save words and phrases. I mean, there's a whole range of technology that makes it much easier. But the basic principle is you want to listen to a lot of comprehensible material. So in the old days, you needed sort of a word list behind every chapter. But today, with the computer, you can actually use more difficult content and look up words and progress that way. So the technology has changed, but the basic way the brain learns hasn't changed.
Do you think it's easier to learn a language when you're a child? That's what most people say. That's the excuse to not managing to learn a language when they are adults.
However, as adults, we have advantages over children. You know, we have a large vocabulary in our own language. So we can very soon start consuming more advanced material, whereas the child has a very limited vocabulary, and so their vocabulary growth is much slower. An adult can actually experience a more rapid rate of vocabulary growth because of the experience, life experience, vocabulary that they have in their own language.
Yeah, that's right. What about beginners? Does your method work for them too?
Well, first of all, there is a lot of beginner content available for many languages. If anything, there is more beginner material available than, say, intermediate. The gap is the intermediate material. The sort of authentic material aimed at the native speaker, there's lots of. Beginner material, there's lots of. It's that intermediate level that is kind of more difficult to find. But the way I begin in a language, and I've done this now for quite a few languages, is it just so happens at LINQ we have these so-called mini stories. These are stories where the same vocabulary repeats 5 times in the same story. And I listen to these over and over and over again. Not at one sitting, because that's not very productive. You don't want to be sort of hitting yourself with the same stuff over and over again. You need repetition, but you also need some variety, some novelty, new things. And so I tend to listen for, say, a 3-month period. I listen to these 60 stories. I do lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't understand anything. I go back to lesson 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I spend a lot of time with this kind of material. It doesn't have to be our mini stories. It can be, assimile, it doesn't matter. But you need that beginner material to sort of start to get a foothold in the language. And in my experience, that early period in the language is in some ways the most satisfying, because you go from zero knowledge, zero comprehension, to some ability to say some things and some comprehension. But now you discover that you're a long way from being fluent. And it's that long path, you know, the plateau, trying to move from, let's say, A2 to B2, that is for many people very frustrating.
Yes, you're right. That can be really frustrating because you're not moving fast enough or at the pace you would like to. So what would you say to people who want to get past this intermediate plateau, who want to really become fluent?
Right.
What would be the method that would work for them?
So the difficulty, the difficulty is, so you have a steep climb initially, and you're very proud of yourself. You understand some things, you can say some things. And in order to keep going, you need to find material that's interesting. So different people are interested in different things. People might be interested in history. They might be interested in stories. If they're learning Japanese, they're interested in anime or whatever it might be. But that authentic and interesting and genuinely, things that you want to be doing in the language are usually difficult. So the hard task is to bridge that in-between period between the beginner material and then the genuinely interesting material. And I think there it's just a matter of discipline. What I do is I sort of vary the difficult material, which is inherently more interesting, and then I go back to the easy material and review that again, and just kind of vary the, fighting in sort of material that has 20% unknown words, but which is inherently interesting to me. Then I go back to the easy material, and slowly, and I emphasize slowly because we learn slowly, I get to a level where I can actually enjoy the language because I'm doing things of interest to me. Yes,
you mentioned a few times repetition. So do you think this is key to learn a language? Do you need a lot of repetition? Do you need to memorize words again and again before you really master them?
Well, it's important to remember that the brain requires repetition in order to learn things, but there's all kinds of research that shows that if you study the same thing over and over again, you are learning less and less. The brain turns off. So you have to introduce novelty. You can look at something now and wander off somewhere else and then come back to it, but you can't just stay with one thing and try and master it. That's not going to work. So I think that's a fundamental thing. The brain will learn, but you have to feed the brain in the way that the brain likes to be fed. So some new things, repeat some old things, and you have to do that based on your own interests and your mood that day and so forth.
So now could you tell us how you approach learning a language that has a different writing system?
Absolutely.
Does your method work as well? How do you go about learning Chinese, Japanese, or even Russian? How fast can you improve with this input method?
This depends entirely on the language. First of all, the writing system. So for me, Arabic and Persian is hard because, you know, I think I've read over 1 million words in both Arabic and Persian, and yet still it's so difficult for me to read in that writing system. If the writing system is the same, it's a lot easier. If the writing system is the same, and if the writing system is totally consistent, like Spanish, then it's easier. If there is common vocabulary, which is the case certainly between Romance languages, and even English has 50-60% words that are identifiable sort of Latin origin words. So an English-speaking person has a lot of vocabulary right away in French that makes it easy. French is not as written as consistently as Spanish, so that creates some difficulties. English is even worse because the writing system is not at all consistent. So all of these things create difficulties. But I would say that if the writing system is the same and it's a more or less similar language, you can achieve significant progress in 3 months, and you can have kind of a comfortable level after a year.
Yeah, great. So, and how much time do you spend learning every day? Do you have, how much time? Is it 1 hour, 2 hours? What would be the minimum you would have to learn to just see improvement? And what would be the max, like after that you're not concentrated anymore?
Well, right now I would say I probably put in 1.5 hours a day and most of it is listening. Because I make breakfast at home, I clean up after breakfast, I clean up after dinner. So right there's 45 minutes of listening. And then if I work out, like I exercise, I'm going to listen. If I'm going anywhere, I'm going to listen. So it's not hard to get in 1 hour a day of listening. Then I just have to find another half hour. So whatever I listen to, I have a transcript for. I don't listen to things that I don't have a transcript for. Unless I'm so advanced in the language that it doesn't matter. But if there's typically, say, 10-15% words that I don't know, even 5% words that I don't know, I will then read them on my iPad using Link, looking up words, reviewing words. There's different activities we have to make sure that I kind of acquire this vocabulary. And it takes time. You have to see the same new vocabulary item many, many times before it becomes part of even your passive vocabulary. But with that, I would say I put in 1.5 hours a day. When I was learning Mandarin Chinese, it was 6-7 hours a day. So if you have 6-7 hours a day, you'll go much faster. You know, when I was in France, of course, I went to Sciences Po, Rue Saint-Guillaume in Paris. So everything was in French. I spoke French all day. All the lectures were in French. I had to do, examen oral in French. Everything was in French. So if you're totally immersed, you're going to move more quickly. But realistically, people who are learning the language where the language isn't spoken and who are busy doing other things, if they can say, I want to listen 45 minutes to 1 hour a day, and I want to find another half hour to work on the transcript to sort of try to learn those words, that's realistic, 1.5 hours a day.
Yeah, great. So another question that I have is a lot of French people struggle with confidence. A lot of French really are ashamed with their accents. They don't dare to speak. So what would you tell them? How can they become fluent, and how can they just be more confident?
I know, that's a real problem. You know, if I look back to when I first tried to become fluent in another language, which was French, by the way, it's a brand new experience. If a person hasn't ever become fluent in another language, then you don't know what that feeling is, and you don't have the confidence that you can do it. You don't know how far you can go in the language. So that's difficult. Once you've done it once or twice, you know you can do it. You know it's just a question of time. but someone who hasn't done it. And as adults, so an adult is very comfortable in their own language. They like to think that they are actually intelligent in their own language. And then they go and speak another language, and now all of a sudden they're not very intelligent. They don't feel confident. How do you overcome that? We're almost dealing with psychology here. You have to say, I want to become, this was my approach to French 60 years ago. I want to become part of them. I want to be part of their group. And people accept you. People don't judge you. People want to communicate with you. You have to accept the fact that you're going to not remember words, you're going to mispronounce words, you're going to not understand. All of these things are constantly going to be there. One of the reasons why I put so much emphasis on comprehension is that if you are with a group or you're talking to a person, and if you don't understand what they're saying, that is very intimidating. You can't keep on saying, I beg your pardon, I beg your pardon. So if you have good comprehension, and you can work on comprehension by yourself, even when I lived in Japan, I had the opportunity to speak to people, I was listening and reading every day, so that if I have good comprehension, then I can struggle to say what I want to say, but I understand what they're saying. And I think that reduces the level of intimidation. But it's also an attitude thing. You have to accept uncertainty. You have to accept that you're not going to be perfect. And you have to not criticize yourself. And don't let other people criticize you. And just keep going. And you will gradually improve.
Yeah, you're right. So what do you think would be the top 3 mistakes that people make when it comes to learning languages? What prevents people and learners from really improving and becoming fluent?
Well, I think the biggest mistake is the one we just discussed. And that is the idea that you're going to master something. That if you study something, you should know it. If you study a word list, you should know those words. If you study something in grammar, you should be able to then speak correctly. That's not going to happen. Our brains learn, they're built to learn, but they learn slowly. And we might get something right today and wrong tomorrow. So don't be a perfectionist. I think that's the biggest mistake, one of the biggest mistakes. The other thing is I think we need to focus on finding things of interest. And I think that's where a teacher can be so valuable. Not so much in teaching the nuts and bolts of the language, but in guiding the learner, helping the learner find content of interest at their level. And so the learner is sort of engaged in learning about things of interest, and that's going to vary from person to person. It might be cooking, it might be nature, it might be anything. But find things of interest and then forget that you're learning the language. Just enjoy learning about things through the language, and don't worry about what you don't understand. Someone mentioned the other day on my YouTube channel that when we're young and we read novels in our own language, whether it be French or English, there's many things we don't understand. I mean, when I read, he mentioned, for example, Treasure Island or something, Robert Louis Stevenson. I remember reading those books as a kid. Lots of things that I didn't understand, but I still enjoyed reading the book. And so we have to accept the fact that there are things we're not going to understand. And that's why I think comprehension questions that teachers like to use are such a bad idea. Because if I understand 60%, if I understood some things wrong, it doesn't matter. I'm still being exposed to the language. So we shouldn't be too demanding of ourselves. We should focus on things of interest. And that's a mistake. What else? Yeah, and also push yourself. The third thing is, it's very easy to stay in sort of learner material, okay? You've got a textbook on English, and you know all of this sort of dialogues that are in that book, and it's all very easy. And you keep on staying in that sort of sheltered learner content sort of world. And you have to push yourself out of that world and get into things of interest, even though it's difficult at first. So I obviously say those 3 things, not that I remember what I said, but don't try to master anything. Go find things of interest and then challenge yourself. Get out of that comfortable learning language environment soon.
Yeah, that's really great advice. So my next question would be, how do you manage to maintain a high level in so many different languages? What would be your advice for people who want to learn multiple languages and just have become fluent and stay fluent for a long time?
Okay, so again, my basic principle is I don't worry about anything. And I recommend that. When you're learning a language, don't worry about it. Don't worry about your mistakes. Don't worry about anything. I don't worry about maintaining my languages. Some of my languages have lapsed. You know, I learned Greek. I was speaking Greek when I was on the island of Crete. I would have trouble now. But I can very quickly recover them. Quickly get back in, review some of the material that I studied before, you know, reconnect some, reestablish some of those neural connections. I don't worry about it. If I need the language, I will refresh it. Now, my strongest languages, it's not an issue. You know, whether French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, it's not going to be a problem. Because once you've reached a certain level, you don't really lose very much. But my weaker languages, very definitely, I would have trouble speaking in them. However, you cannot maintain so many languages. I can't say, okay, today I'm going to, you know, refresh 3 languages and tomorrow 3 other languages. So I don't worry about it. And I think having that attitude of, you know, whatever happens in the language is fine. I don't understand, that's fine. I said something wrong, I made a mistake that I didn't make yesterday, that's fine. So I don't worry about it. And I think that's a good bit of advice for all language learners. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I understand. But so many people in France worry about making mistakes, being judged, and making a fool of themselves. And one thing that I wanted to ask you is that people seem to be afraid of speaking English and afraid of making mistakes in English, but it doesn't seem to be the same for French people in France, at least for other languages like Spanish or Italian. I've never heard someone saying that they are bad at Spanish. They would say that they are beginner, not bad, but that's the case for English. There seems to be a difference between English and other languages. Less pressure probably for other languages. What do you think about that?
2 comments there. I think first of all, the way you described the way French is taught in France is no different than the way other languages are taught. Excuse me, the way English is taught in France. It's the same everywhere, right? And people are afraid and so forth. However, your comment about the French learners have more fun with Spanish is very interesting. I think if we can treat the learning of any language as a game, the more relaxed we are, the more we enjoy it, the better we're going to do. And because English has been sort of established as this sort of, we need it for work, it's an obligation, I must have English, so therefore it's not fun anymore. Whereas Spanish is just fun. And, you know, I can equate that to say, in Canada, you know, if you're in the English school system, you have to learn French because it's an official language. Well, that's right, but that's not very motivating. You tell a kid who lives in Vancouver, the nearest French-speaking community is 5,000 kilometers away. Well, there are some in the West, but by and large it's in Quebec, Eastern Ontario. You say you have to learn French because it's your duty, it's your civic duty. That's not very motivating. And so those kids might find it more fun to learn Spanish or Chinese. If someone learns another language, like if the kids here were to learn the language they're more interested in learning and that they have more fun with, once they've learned one language, it'll be easier for them to learn that other sort of obligatory language. So yeah, I think it's unfortunate that English is sort of set up there for everyone has to learn English. English, you need it, it's the world language and stuff. It takes the fun out of learning English. And language learning should be fun.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's such a shame. What would be your last advice for people watching this video on language learning? How can they improve faster? How can they be more relaxed and be more confident in a foreign language?
I think my final thought is, you know, Stephen Krashen, who is an American professor who has basically created this new way of teaching languages based on comprehensible input. I had a conversation with him at my YouTube channel, and we were talking about pronunciation. And he said he was in a class, or maybe someone else was in a class, where they were learning French, and this guy had very poor pronunciation in French. But one day he came to class and he put on a beret. People think that all French people wear berets, which of course isn't the case. But he put on a beret and he pretended he was French and he was exaggerating his French accent, and all of a sudden his pronunciation improved because he was having fun with it. And so I think my advice, and so that's a perfect example. As long as he was, you know, English speaker trying to speak French, he was embarrassed to try too hard to pronounce French correctly, it's almost less risk to pronounce the language with your heavy, say, English accent, speaking French, whereas once he was play acting, then it became a game, and then he improved his pronunciation. So my big advice is, make it more fun, make it a game, don't worry about things, and trust that the brain will learn if you put in the time.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you so much for all the insights and advice you gave us in this video. It was a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you again.
Okay, I enjoyed it. Good luck. Bon courage, as they say, to all of your learnings. Okay, bye-bye.